Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I don't know what that is in Spanish. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope everyone had a break and a little bite to eat. And we're going to get back going with a little bit more on how to write grants. So I know this is a little tough, complicated information for after lunch. But hopefully there will be no siestas during this, right? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go over real quickly just kind of what a federal agency looks for from our perspective, what we're looking for in a successful grant and how you manage it, to give you kind of a sense of what really matters to us, right? What do we want? And then Catherine Carey on my staff is going to get into a little more of the nitty gritty of the pieces and parts of the grant applications. And it'll apply to almost any federal grant, but then some specifics on our program as well. And the car horn is helping me present here. Yay. Okay. All right. Well, let's get started, because this is what you want, right? A group of panelists that are all going to score you a 10 and move you forward. But just some general guidance when it comes to federal funding is you want to make sure you understand what a grant program can and cannot fund. You want to make it sure it's the right fit. You want to make sure the application is complete. And we're going to talk about how to complete one of those, of course, a little bit more today. And then there's also the piece of moving through that red tape or the federal regulations. And that's just a part of it. And we're going to help you kind of understand that and hopefully make that a little less frightening. So you'll be ready. Okay, so thinking about what we can and cannot fund, every federal program is a little bit different, and y'all heard me talk about 8 of them or more today, and you could see that each one has its own little idiosyncrasies. So one requires a different level of significance. Sometimes they require match. So it's just making sure that you're understanding those parts. And federal agencies can have different funding mechanisms that fund very different types of projects. So like for us, for the Historic Preservation Fund, it actually has some rules about limiting administrative costs and some other things like that. And then, of course, it brings in the Secretary's standards in the National Register. But a federal grant from HUD or a community development block grant through that program is going to probably have some different parameters that are just as important. So understanding those pieces is a key element. And then when you understand that, you'll know if your project is the right fit. We never recommend what we call the shotgun approach. Like, I'm just going to apply to I don't know, what are we having, a wedding? What's going on? Something's going on. It's more exciting than what's going on here, probably. Anyway, don't just apply for grant programs willy-nilly, because I'm sorry, I'm just about to crack up laughing. This is hilarious. I've spoke before with a train coming by behind me and various eccentric other things, but this is a new one for sure. So you want to make sure you match up to the correct program. So let's, for example, if you have a property that was built in 1900, you're not going to be applying to our semi-quin grant program that requires properties built before 1800, right? And what happens is when you aren't the correct applicant and it's not the correct resource, we go through a review at the beginning and we kick you out. Boom, boom, boom. So what we don't want that to happen. We want to make sure you're in the right spot and to the right funding agency. Okay, so it's about choosing the right program, making sure it's the right fit, making sure you're eligible to apply. So there's a lot of places that we have rules there. So maybe it's a grant that only goes to municipalities. CDBG was one of those. Maybe it only goes to nonprofits. You saw a few of ours only go to states and tribes. So making sure you understand if you're eligible is step one. And then meeting that threshold criteria. So one thing we see quite a bit of, especially with our Save America's Treasures program, is a lot of people apply for that thinking I'm listed in the National Register, I'm eligible, but they're listed at that local or state level of significance, so they're not. And it really kind of hurts our hearts when we see all the time that someone's put into an application, but then they weren't really eligible for that program in the first place. So that's pretty important, is understanding that threshold criteria. We've got a lot of different kinds of those now. We've got history of equal rights, African American civil rights, all of those things. You need to have a project that tags to that threshold, that it involves somehow the struggle for equal rights. So keeping those things in mind. And if you're not sure, ask the grant staff. That is what we are there for. Our staff is, grown up to about 20 something people. And we have people that man our inbox every single day, check it repeatedly, check the phone. And that purpose of them being there is to answer those questions. So if you're not sure, don't be afraid to ask that. We don't want you to waste your time on an application that's not a good fit. And we don't want to waste our time on it either, because we all have a lot of work to do. So just don't be afraid to ask. Looking at examples of previously funded projects is a great way to kind of understand what's expected of you. For each one of our programs, we have a sample application on our website. So though it might not be exactly like the one you're going to write, look at what they did and why it was successful. We don't put up bad applications. We put up good examples up there. So look at that as a sample application. Some places that you'll apply to, and some agencies, even government, might review a draft application. That's not something we do at the Park Service. We can't handle the workload of that. But it's certainly something you could ask a foundation or a nonprofit or a state agency that you're applying to. I know the National Trust for Historic Preservation does a lot of that kind of, you write a letter first to indicate what you'd like to do, and then they help you prepare the application. So knowing that kind of format and process is important. We want to see that the project you're applying for is the next logical step. So what I mean by that is, we don't want to go in and fund a project that's going to refinish your interior, like refinish your floors, when you have a hole in the ceiling that's letting water in. So we want to make sure you're doing the next logical thing. Sometimes we'll see an application and it says, we want to redo all of our systems, our HVAC, our plumbing, our electrical, and those are things that we can pay for, but the roof is in terrible condition. The windows are blown out. So what we really like to see is that you're taking care of that building envelope, the outside of that building that is, the elements can do so much damage for. And then maybe that's your first grant from us. And then the next one maybe is looking at systems, or interior refinishing, or plaster repair, or even accessibility. So one of the things we fund a lot of is ADA, making a building accessible with lifts and ramps and elevators and things like that. But we don't want to go bringing people in if the building's not safe and secure yet for them. So making sure it's the next logical step. And part of that piece is that you've done enough pre-planning. When you're coming in for a $750,000 grant from us, you need to know what you're asking for. So that may be involving some professional expertise, like an architect or an engineer, or you've gotten technical assistance from your state office to help guide you in what are the correct things to ask. Is the work that I'm asking for, does it meet the Secretary's standards? You don't want to come into the Historic Preservation Fund to demolish a building. That's not a good plan, right? And that does happen sometimes, just so you know. Okay, so completing the applications, the next big step. You've figured out you've got the right program, you're a good fit, you're eligible. You have to start early. These federal grants are big and there's a lot of paperwork, and unfortunately there's nothing I can do to change that. We have tried to minimize the parts we need as much as possible, But there is just a standard set of forms that Catherine's going to go over briefly, and they take some time to figure out. So allow that. There's systems that you have to get into. Some of those can take 4 weeks to 2 months to get into. So starting a grant application to a federal agency the week before is not a good idea. And make sure you're reading the entire application. There's always a notice of funding award posted for any federal grant on Grants.gov. That is where we have to post all of our grants. And make sure you're reading that and the guidelines thoroughly. It's a long document for us. It's about 30 something pages, but it's important that you understand the pieces and parts that you're going to have to do and accomplish to get the funding. Also, don't assume knowledge. Don't be too close to the project. Make sure you have an outside person also there to review your application, to look and make sure it makes sense. Sometimes you've been working with this site and it's so part of your community and so part of your life that you kind of maybe think everybody knows about it too. Well, we don't. I saw a bunch of sites this week that I had never seen before and didn't know anything about. So making sure that we can understand it through the application and you're telling us all the information is good. So don't be the only set of eyes on that. We need you to be complete and tell us all the information that we need to know, but we also need you to be concise. So as an example, we just had our Save America's Treasures preservation grants closed. We have 85 applications in. Each one of those will have to have 2 internal reviews and then go to a panel and have another 4 reviews. That's a lot of work on top of managing the grants we already have. So put yourself kind of in the reviewer's shoes. You want to, less is more, but you want to make sure the application is clear, says what you want to do, why it's important, what is the threat, and why is this going to be good for your community? Like, we want to know what's going to happen after we fix this building. That's an important part of the sustainability piece. The application needs to stand alone. Do not expect a reviewer to go look at an attachment that you provided. I had a project once and it just said under scope of work, it said, see the attached historic structures report. Well, guess what I was not going to do? Go and pull that down and read like a 400-page document to figure out what they want to do. So you need to make sure it's okay to add things, but make sure if they all fell away, that attachment, that application would be fine on its own. Make sure you follow the format of the application. Don't make up your own format. We have suggested worksheets to use. I recommend that you use them. When you're a reviewer, you kind of get in this like mode and you're looking at all these applications, and if something's off, it gets confusing. And that's probably not what you want your grant reviewer to be thinking, is I'm confused right now while they're reading your application. And make sure you answer each question. Usually we have 4 questions, 4 main areas, criteria on a grant application, and they have multiple questions within them. Go back and make sure you've answered each one. And maybe start with the one at the bottom first. What I often see in applications is there's 4 parts, and you start off in that part number 1, and you're like excited and writing, and that part's really good. And then as you go down, you get tired. And then by the time you're at the 4th question, you're like, yeah, we'll do that, So think about it, or take it in pieces on separate days, but you want each one of those parts of telling us what you're going to do to be really strong, because they all get scored with points. So they're all important. And make sure that you're addressing the need and the threat, so that whatever we are doing with our money, helping you fix, is solving your problem. So make sure the budget is matching what you're asking for. So we don't want you to say, well, the building's falling down and this and that, and kind of like the example I used before, but we want to put in an elevator and an ADA ramp. But then when we look at the budget, maybe we're fixing the roof or something. They need to match up. So make sure things are tracking throughout all of the documents in the application. And again, understanding those funding requirements, things that are eligible. One thing federal agencies cannot fund is contingency. And a lot of contractors love to do a quote and then have so much in contingency fees. Don't put that in there. We need to roll it up into your request for construction dollars. So just be real clear, and we outline these things very clearly in the notice of funding. So if it's not eligible, try not to put it in there. If it does require match, know what can and cannot be used. A lot of groups will, or federal agencies, or even nonprofits may require a cash match, and they might require that you have it in the bank and show those funding statements. Make sure you know that. For us, a lot of our programs, as you heard, don't require a match. But we do say is if you include match, that's a competitive advantage that you have. Even if it's a small amount, you're showing that local commitment to the project and that you're willing to contribute to it. So make sure you understand those pieces. Sometimes a match doesn't have to be cash. It can be in kind, donated labor, donated services. Maybe someone's donated you the scaffolding for the building or the use of it, but you need to value that out and know what that is and know if you can use that in that grant program. And it varies drastically. And then knowing if you have to have that match in place at the time of application, or can you still keep raising it as you go? Those are important things to know. And they're back. Okay. And they're emphasizing that y'all should understand the matching part, right? Okay, and then repeat applicants. This is something we see a lot of now. We didn't so much when we just had Save America's Treasures, because I mentioned that one grant per project, but our other programs don't have that limitation. So we have several projects right now that might have one Save America's Treasures and 3 African American Civil Rights grants. That could be up to $2 million in a project. But repeat applicants, it's important that if for some reason you didn't get funded and you want to apply again, that you ask for your comments. We are happy to provide your comments. And even if you get funded, ask for your comments. It can only help your next application, right? By the time your project has gone through our reviews and you're not funded, if you got close and went to panel, you will have at least probably 5 to 6 experts have looked at your application and your project and provided their advice. And these are federal experts on these projects. So it's worth knowing what they're going to say. And we make that really easy. We tell you in our letter, here's how you get your comments. You can shoot us an email and we'll email those comments back to you. So definitely look at them and definitely rewrite the next application based on them. Grant managers are like elephants. We have really good memory. So we can remember your applications year to year. And we can usually can tell, oh, they got their comments and they addressed this. This is better. It's a better fit. Or, oh, they didn't get their comments and they didn't change their application at all. And guess how that's going to go? Not very well, right? So those are all important things. I talked a little bit about attachments to your applications. Supplemental information needs to enhance the application, but not take the place of it. And that's really important. My staff knows that letters of support are, I'll just be honest, I hate them. I find organizations can spend more time getting their letters of support from their congressional staff or whoever, and don't spend the time on their application. For us, they are not that critical unless you have someone you're partnering with. They might be acting as your fiscal agent. They might be providing match. They might be the owner of the property. Then we want to see a letter of support from them. If it's not part of the application and submitted to us online in Grants.gov as part of it, it won't be considered. So you can spend however much time it takes, I have no idea, getting your congressional folks or your state folks writing letters, but unless it's part of your application for us, the reviewers won't see it. So just make sure you know if letters of support are called out and said to be an important thing, then yes, you do need to spend time on it. For us, it's not so much. And so you need to kind of understand that difference. Sometimes a letter of resolution may be required, either from your municipality, your council, maybe from the tribe. So make sure those often take some time. And if that's a requirement, then you have time to do that. And then photographs. Well, a photo is worth 1,000 words, and I've asked you to do a concise application. So here's your chance to add a lot to it, right? The photos should really tell the story. They need to show the threat and they need to support the application, and make sure they include clear and good captions. We have a photo form that you can pop the photos into and write a caption. That's the best way to send it to us. And it takes up to about 20 photos. So you can put as many as you want. You might want to include historic photos. We saw a lot of historic photos in the presentations earlier that tell the story of the change of that building over time. And that may be an important part of your application to show us. The other thing is, I always say take good photos, but bad photos. It's great to see your building on a sunny day in Puerto Rico and it looks lovely and the clouds are perfect and all that. Or there's a rainbow like we saw behind it yesterday. But if you have a hole in the roof and water's pouring in, or you can see daylight through it, go out there in the rain and take that picture. Make that bad picture needs to be as good as the good pictures. You need to show us the threat. That's an important piece of it. So let's say you followed all these directions and advice and you've gotten the grant, and now it's time to move through that red tape, the federal regulations. So it's best if you understand at least most of what's going to be required before you applied for the grant, but there will always be some things that we might surprise you with. And usually we try to do a pretty good job of orienting you to the rules and regulations. But one of the things to be familiar with, and if you're having trouble sleeping at night, I highly recommend reading it, is 2 CFR 200. And that is the guidance for financial assistance for all federal agencies. So just being familiar with it, knowing where to find it, knowing how to look things up. Do I have it memorized? Good gosh, no. But I know where to go search for things when I need the answer. So that's a good resource to have in your back pocket. And remembering that if there is match required or you provide match, it has to follow all of the same rules as the federal share. So it can't be different. And what are those rules? So there are some hoops that you have to jump through. Anything governmental, you're going to have to do competitive selection, be that of your consultants, your contractors, your equipment and supplies. Now, sometimes there's smaller amounts. What happened? Well, clearly I can't talk without my slides here. All right, let's see if it'll. Did it just stop sharing? All right, hold on. I thought I was going to get lucky and make it through this one without problem. All right, there we go. No, I'm not going to start over, I promise. I was almost done too, man. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, sorry. Competitive selection. So just keep in mind, you might have an architect that you've worked with for 20 years and you want to keep working with that person. That's okay. But they need to not be involved in preparing your grant application. That would actually exclude them from participating. Same with the contractor, that kind of thing. So you may need to then go out to bid and you can include them then, but they can't kind of have that pre-knowledge. So those are some things to think about when you're dealing with federal or government money. Review and approval, send in your information early, get input, and make sure you have all your ducks in the row that before you receive your reimbursement, and be aware of the requirements. I mentioned a few earlier this morning, things like signs and easements, but there's also reporting, interim reports, final reports. There might be an audit involved. You may have to show that you have a single audit. We take every grantee through a risk assessment process, and that part of that is looking at your financial capabilities of managing a grant. And think about time limits, especially actually, this is a thing of the applications, is a lot of times you'll tell us we're going to get through this whole grant in 6 months, but that's unrealistic. We usually start every project off with 2 to 3 years. So make sure your planning there matches up with what it may realistically take. It's okay to take a little longer to do it correctly. That's not a bad thing. And then good grantees might get funded again, and again, and again, and again, as we're seeing these days. So keeping that close relationship with your grant manager is really important. I know I've made lifetime friends that I manage grants with. And so it really is a relationship, and you may be working together for 3 to 4 years. So you'll get to know that person. Keep them informed. If you're worried about something doesn't seem like it's going all right, let them know. An email, a phone call. Doesn't have to wait for your next interim report. It's far better for a grant manager to not be surprised. And then completing your reporting on time, just being responsible for asking for extensions before your grant's already expired. Know your deadlines and what's required of those things. And then the other piece is always have a backup for your project manager, for who's managing your grant. I hate to say it, but I've actually had some grants where the person managed the grant either passed away, and so did all of the work and understanding, or there was a fight in the organization and the person ran off with all the grant files. And so they have to rebuild the history of that grant project. So just making sure that maybe it's your board or another staff person knows where you're at in that process is really important. Okay, I think it's time for me to turn it over to Catherine. Yeah. And then we'll let y'all ask questions at the end.
Good to go. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Catherine Carey, and I work with Megan's team doing grant outreach and education. And basically, I'm the person when you run into a problem, you can turn to, and I can see if I can assist you. There are many things I can do, and there are a lot of things I can't do, but I can at least try to get you to the right resource for those items. So, around preparation for the grant application itself. Earlier, Megan walked you through all the 8 or so competitive programs that are available. She's made it really clear that you need to make sure that your projects and the grant program match apples for apples, oranges for oranges. There's no reason to try to fit your project into a program that it's not eligible for. That just is wasting a lot of your time. I'd rather us find something that did fit better for you. And then someone from the SHPO spoke about the National Register eligibility, and that's going to be another really key factor, as was repeated, in that each program is going to just have a different requirement around that National Register eligibility. And that's where you're going to turn back to your SHPO and have them assist you and make sure that you're walking the right path for that program. To get started on an application, you actually are not going to be going through a system that is our system. You're going to be walking through a couple of other systems. And the first thing you're going to need to do is go to your, oh, we're back. Yeah, you're going to need to go to sam.gov. If you're not familiar, I see nods. Some people know about sam.gov already. I would say if you're considering making an application in 2023, when we leave today, you find some time this week or next week and you go to sam.gov and you get yourself registered now, even though you may not apply for a grant for 6 months from now. That is the process. That is the platform that's going to wind up doing reimbursements for when you're awarded a grant. It's just, you're going to need to be registered there. You may think you are registered there, but it's very common that registration's lapsed, and it has to be updated. It has to be up to date to make application. So check that when you leave. This indicates that they're doing registrations at 2+ weeks, but we have a program ending in February and about 2 weeks, and people do not have their sam.gov, and they're telling them it's 4 to 6 weeks. So if you can't tell, I'm pretty serious about this. I spend a lot of time with people that have problems with sam.gov. The other item that you're going to want to do is to go to grants.gov after that. And Megan indicated all of our grant applications are there, and that they're not going to be there until we open a grant. Our grant applications, are we aiming for 90 days this year? So most of our applications will be open for a 90-day period. We've indicated signing up for our bulletin is the best way to know about that, but you can also sign up for notifications on grants.gov, and they will let you know when those open. Everything you need is going to be there, everything. You're going to be going there. You're just going to sign in. You're going to set up a workspace there. It's going to be a workspace that you can start working in. You can go back and forth in. You can add other people on your team and have them put information in it. It's going to be a place you want to be familiar with. And they have wonderful, small, brief videos as resources to kind of walk you through what you're going to need to do. Grants.gov, I think it's really scary for people, but the information it provides is all the information you need is provided there. And they even have 24/7 assistance with questions, and they can live chat you, or you can send them emails, whatever you need to do. They're there to assist you. I always recommend beyond sam.gov problems, Adobe problems in grants.gov. And you need to check. They're going to tell you what version you need to have of Adobe. And if you do not have that, you need to upload it and get your version, up to speed. Otherwise, you will be fighting with the system the entire time. And at the end, it's pretty frantic around submittals when things are not looking the way you wanted them to look there. Save often, nothing unfamiliar with that, but remind yourself to do it. And do watch for grants.gov is very good at indicating when something's not matching up, when they're not taking information, but you do have to look for their error buttons, and they'll direct you to where your problem is, and you can make that correction and continue. This is what it's actually going to look like. This is where everything you need is going to be. You're going to pop up a grant opportunity. I don't know why this is forwarding on it. Oh, it's autoing. I was like, why is it doing this? Okay. This is what it will look like. You can see there's a red circle around a tab. That tab says related documents. There are 2 tabs. The next tab to the right of that is called the package tab, and all the documents you need are going to be in both of those tabs. There are a lot of documents. Do not get frantic. You will make your way through them. There are a number of those that you might not even use. There are some of those that are just attachment forms, and there are others that you're just going to sign your name. So it looks like a lot, but it isn't. There's one particular document that Megan mentioned to you that you'll find there called the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And I think she was very clear about this, but that document has every bit of information you need in it to work yourself through this application. The problem is that people don't take time to read the document, and it is pretty easy. It's a reference point. I often send people back to it. I would use it. I would use it if you can. You will find the questions for the narrative that you're going to need to write there. You're going to find the point system there. Anything around an easement you will find there. And you'll also find this list you see here that will indicate everything that you need to make application. You should use this as well as a checkoff as you're completing your grant, to be sure that you have each of these items to include in your grant submittal. I'm going to just indicate, you can see there are a number of 424 forms that you will complete through this, as well as an attachments form where all your attachments will go. The two documents you're going to spend the most time on are going to be your project description worksheet and your budget justification worksheet. Images were discussed, as well as letters of support, not preferred. And for some of you, possibly a letter of ownership consent, but that is something we can discuss if you're making application later. I mentioned the 424 series. We're just going to skim through this really, really quickly. I think one thing you can see in bold, the second 424A requirement for non-construction programs, where it says required even for construction. I'm going to say it again. If you have a construction project, even though it says non-construction program, fill out this form. Do not leave it blank. It's just a really quick way to lose points for your grant application. And it's a very easy thing to fill out as well for construction forms. Again, the others are quite clear. There's instruction for how to do this as you're walking through it. The lobbying form, particularly for most people, will be just a signature that you'll do. I mentioned two important worksheets. This is one of those, the budget justification worksheet. If you've done grants of any type before, you probably have worked with something somewhat familiar with this or built out something yourself similar to this. This is going to be a sheet that's in a grid system that does actually quite a bit of sort of auto calculating for you as well in certain sections. And it should be pretty easy for you. You're going to see some specifications on each of the grant programs. It's a little different around the admin costs and indirect costs depending on the program. Again, all items that we can walk through with you as you're filling these out. The project description worksheet was briefly discussed, and this is, I think, for most people where they'll spend the majority of their time writing this, either individually or with other members of your staff. It is broken into 4 sections. A section that sort of is asking for the history of your project and its connection, its significance to the particular grant program you're applying for, as well as National Register information or eligibility for that. It's pretty clear. We discussed sort of presenting this in a clear, concise way, but I would also say to write it in a fashion that is readable, that somebody wants to read. You know, make it your story or the story of your project, and really see if you can write it in a way that the reader can read it with a nice flow to it. It doesn't need to be a thesis, an academic document. That's not that important if it has the specifics in it. It needs to be something very readable. And as mentioned earlier as well, there are questions around that section as well as the other 3 sections. Answer every question. Do not leave Any question that's asked in those sections, do not leave it blank. Megan's theory that people get tired and don't complete the last two sections, which are feasibility and sustainability, is very accurate. Sometimes in reviews, you get to those sections and there literally is one sentence around that, but you'll have 3 questions that were asked around it. So take your time, start early, write, rewrite, use Grammarly or whatever you have to check your grammar and dot your I's and cross your T's and make sure it's perfect. The second section in this worksheet is need, urgency, and threat. And that is another area where sometimes people describe what's happened at the project, but they don't really say why they need the money right now. You know, what is going to happen if the project you're proposing does not take place. So make sure that you do show some urgency in that writing of that need, threat section. I mentioned feasibility and sustainability. And again, if you just follow the cues that are given to you and you complete the document as it's requested, you should be fine. This is the evaluation criteria for each of those sections. A number of people will be reviewing this. It'll go through an intake process, and that's where, if you've left attachments off, if you haven't completed forms, that will be noted, things like that, and it will move on to an internal review with several people looking at it there, using this number system, this point system, and the questions that were posed in each of these sections to see if you've answered them clearly, if it makes sense, if the information you provided in the narrative is matching up with your budget sheets that you've given, that they, you know, equal each other, that there are no red flags around those. We're just wanting to see that. How did this get on auto, whatever? It is annoying, especially as for me. As we said, pictures are worth thousands of words if they're relevant. We do like the historical photographs, but we also like the current photographs. That was described very clearly. I would say check the dates of those photographs, though. You know, use something up to date. Don't use something from 4 years ago, because we're going to go, oh, well, what's this look like now? Is it still in a condition that we would want to fund it, or is it beyond, you know, where are we with this? So use current photographs to tell the story. If you have trouble with the image worksheet, which is a wonderful document, again, don't fret. You can put it in a Word document, just caption it, put your dates on there, and you're good to go. Letters of support. If someone's partnering with you in your town or in your state or whatever it is, if you have a partnership, do provide the letter of support. Show that you're working with your community. Show that you're, you know, that this is an investment that goes beyond you. The information for who that letter should be addressed to and how that letter is attached. All of that is included in the notice of funding opportunity. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. So it should be addressed to Megan. I'm not going over procurement. She's done that really well, other than to state what I saw you all write notes, which is she stated clearly and is really important. Be sure in your application that there are no signs that the numbers that you've gotten for your budget are from a particular source that you're going to want to use, you know, or if you're using that source, make sure that if someone asks you or state in your application if you're using those numbers, that you did receive bids to get those numbers, so that we know that you, even in your early stages before you are awarded a grant, that you followed procurement as you should have in advance of the application. And then I think the easement requirements are fairly well addressed in the notice of funding opportunity, but there are a couple of items around your budgets that are important to note, particularly because they're items that you can include and will want to include. And because most all of these require an easement, you can include in the budget the expense of recording the easement and having the easement drawn up. So put those expenses in your budget. You can do the same for if you are someone that is eligible for a National Register nomination. It hasn't been written yet. You can also include the expense of having that nomination written in your application, and we highly suggest that you do that. I think the only other item I would mention around budget and that you saw the indirect cost item mentioned. If you are going to use indirect costs in your budget, just remember by doing that, you are, I mean, that's your choice. You can do all direct costs, but if you do indirect costs, just remember that that money is sort of coming away from your grant, your project budgets, but it's sort of being pulled out of that. So you're losing a bit of money there for your actual project. Again, for the 18th time, give yourself time to do the application. Your first takeaway is what? SAM.gov, go get registered. I suggest before you sit down to put all of it together that you have it all together, put it in front of you or have it in your computer together so that you can put everything together nicely. We mentioned having an outside reader. Highly suggest that. There's nothing to be intimidated by having someone do that. It's only going to point out to you things that you probably just could not see because you are so familiar with a project. I mentioned using a language correction tool. It's as a proofreading mechanism. It's a suggestion, just a suggestion. I think you should also know that it's very rare that we extend deadlines. It happens occasionally if we do not have enough applications, which is pretty rare. So there are no exceptions, there are no extensions, and things do happen right at the end. So just be prepared that there will be some kind of a glitch or systems error. Plan ahead. I tell you that, and I still will be talking to people at midnight before that are running into issues because they didn't do it, and that's fine. I'm happy to talk to you, but I want to be sure that you know that we're aware that that you're aware that there are no extensions of any sort. And then a couple of items I would also include. We do have the resources I've provided you, as well as many other resources on our webpage. I'd highly recommend you go to those. We mentioned sample applications, and with those sample applications, that includes a budget worksheet as well as a project narrative for each of the programs. But beyond that, there's also a system you can look, if you're looking for projects or interesting things, there's a system called IRMA, which is found in our resources. So you can look at other projects that have been funded in the past as well. There's also a section on our website that a lot of people don't look at in advance of making applications, but if you have the time, I highly recommend it. It's more on the after you've been awarded and how grants are managed and what will happen and your reporting. And if you're a staff that's small and you're concerned about your capacity to be able to manage a grant, this might be a resource to look at just to see if it's something that you think you can you can do on your own. It describes very clearly what the reporting requirements are for you. So the truth is, get to writing. We really want to see some applications from Puerto Rico so badly. And Megan mentioned the staff that's there to help you with your questions with the inbox. They will do that. If you need really specific information, that is what my job is to aid you. And people ask often. I mean, I can't even tell you how frequently I either talk by phone or by email with applicants over and over. And that's because we want to see you be successful with your applications. We're here to support you in that. And there is not a dumb question, as we say. There really is no dumb question. And you can ask it more than once too. So do any of you have questions about the application process? No? If you would like to quietly ask questions outside of this space, feel free to flag us down. We're happy to do that with you and exchange email addresses. If this is something you just want to consider for now, you never know when a project might present itself, and we'd love to help you with that if we can. Thanks.
Okay. So everyone's ready to write a grant now, right? Okay. Well, I hope to see some applications from Puerto Rico in our multiple opportunities that are coming up. So I want to thank y'all from the Park Service side for participating with us today. It's great to have such a large crowd, and thank you for all the hospitality we've had since we've been here. We're going to break now, give you a 15-minute move around stretch break. And then you'll get started back with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions to start on learning how to be ready for the next crisis, disaster, storm, all of those things. So we've got some great trainers here, and the Park Service is excited to be able to bring this to you. So I hope you'll all enjoy it. And remember, it continues tomorrow into more detail. So if you aren't signed up for tomorrow, I think we still have room, and you're welcome to come back and learn even more about how to make a resilient community. Okay. Thank you all very much. Back in 15.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the National Park Service for their amazing presentations and hosting us here. This is kind of that second component of the training. I'm here as part of the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. The mission is to educate, train, and advocate for preservation at the national level, and specifically for local commissions. So kind of making that connection for your local commission. So I'm really excited to be here. My name is Frederique Mettner. I am the City Historic Preservation Planner for West Palm Beach, Florida, and we have a population of about 200,000 people, and we have 19 historic districts, over 5,000 cultural resources. I'm also involved from at the county level, where Palm Beach County is a very diverse county, geographically as well as socio and economically. So I can appreciate some of the conflicts some of the communities here in Puerto Rico are having. And I grew up in Miami and lived through Hurricane Andrew. So I definitely understand some of the challenges that you are facing with hurricanes and natural disasters, as well as earthquakes and other things. And what I want to say up front is we are all preservationists, of course. We love historic buildings. When someone joins the office and they get introduced around, I always say I'm the old buildings lady. I love historic preservation. I love old buildings, but it's really important to just put out there that people come first in disasters, and we recognize that and we honor that. You know, besides the loss of life, just the physical and emotional toll that disasters take, whether that's, you know, a year without power, not being able to do laundry, like we recognize that. So I just want to put it into context of where, yes, we're focusing on buildings, but we understand that people certainly come first. And so today is kind of a teaser. Tomorrow's the big day of lots of wonderful training, but wanted to talk about preservation and preservation planning and how you incorporate that into disaster and resiliency planning. So important that we all kind of use the same terminology. That's very important because otherwise you may be representing one type of project when really the action is a different type of project. So there's really 4 approaches in the preservation world. We all call ourselves preservationists, but true preservation is to just stabilize a site and make sure it doesn't deteriorate any further. There's, of course, also restoration. Restoration is where you're bringing a site back to a certain time period. Perhaps you're removing later additions because, again, you're interpreting it because of a particular person or event in history that occurred there. Reconstruction, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's to accurately rebuild based on photo or other documentation to accurately rebuild. And then there's rehabilitation. And in reality, that's really what most of us do. I know there's representatives here from historic sites, historic museums, and certainly that's a restoration project, sometimes a preservation project. But I'd say the majority of planners and preservation commissions are rehabilitating buildings, because if they're not economically viable or if they are not resilient, then we have missed the big picture. We are not going to, these buildings aren't feasible to use. So rehabilitation is really bringing a structure back to life using updated technology, whether that's HVAC systems, or again, perhaps elevating a building to address sea level rise and other climate change issues, but again, making it feasible, keeping the character defining features of a property, but perhaps adding additions. And so that's why, of course, the Department of Interior, where the National Park Service is housed, has the Secretary Interior standards for these 4 different treatments. So I kind of start with that base level so that we all know the terminology, and I'm sure all of you do, but just kind of a refresher that I'll keep using the word preservation, but in action and reality, I think most of it's really referring to rehabilitation. So a preservation plan, because again, today's little intro is really about the planning stage. A preservation plan establishes preservation policy. It establishes or strengthens existing policy that you may have, and stresses to the elected officials that preservation is very important as part of your local planning process. And sometimes it helps you start a preservation ordinance or strengthen one that you already have. So you're kind of having a vision of what are your priorities in your community and how are you're documenting them and communicating those, because you want the community's goals to be established with lots of stakeholder input, and you want to be able to communicate that. And each community is different. So we are here to this afternoon and tomorrow to give you ideas, generate, some thoughts and discussions, but you have your biggest resources are the people here in your room, in the room where you can talk to each other, learn from each other. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. And each community, though, will have their own perspective and see where they fall on the spectrum of preservation. How strict do you want to be, again, in preservation? And how do you want your infill construction to be? Do you want your infill construction to be very contemporary? Do you want it to be very traditional? So this is something that, again, a community will communicate through a preservation plan and have that documented. It also informs property owners of what the expectation is of them, the citizens at large and residents, so that everybody's, again, on the same page of the level of priority for preservation. And it's also important for your elected officials to understand how important is preservation to you as a community. So many times we ask those running for political office where they stand on certain social issues, but if preservation is important to you, that's another thing to ask your candidates is, do they understand preservation and do they understand that it's important to your community? So a preservation plan that you've developed will educate citizens about their heritage and its value, and it creates an agenda for future preservation activities and sets priorities. And that will then also dovetail with your fiscal plan of how do you fund them and what's a priority, because obviously we heard lots of great ways to apply for grants, but maybe which grant do you go for, do you apply for first? And then if you have the political and citizen buy-in of what's a priority, then you can all be on the same page on that. A preservation plan will also be mindful of zoning and land use law and making sure that a built environment is taking preservation into consideration. So zoning can sometimes help or hinder, help or hinder preservation. So if you have a neighborhood that's consistently 1 or 2 stories, but your zoning would allow for 10 or 20 stories, then that's in direct conflict. And you're going to have a problem because the economic reality of a 10 or 20 story building is often going to outweigh the preservation of that 1 or 2 story building, especially if it's not properly protected. So making sure your zoning is in alignment with your preservation goals. And again, your preservation plan will address that. And so that's why that's very important to understand the preservation, the zoning component of preservation. So kind of the path to get a preservation plan is identify what's important, evaluate is the significance of them in terms of kind of a hierarchy, designate at the different levels that are available to you in your community. If you don't have a local preservation ordinance, perhaps again, you go to a national register designation, and then how do you treat those properties after they're designated? And again, it's important to get all constituents involved in this. That would be commissioners, both historic preservation commissioners, as well as elected commissioners, local staff, and not just local staff in terms of the historic preservation staff, but your planning staff. And I would highly encourage you to get your building officials involved so they understand what the goal is as well. We have parents and kids up there as kind of fun inclusion, because of course, again, we want all the different perspectives. Sometimes if you include the elders in a community, they'll have additional layers to share with you on particular properties of why it's important. Maybe from an architectural standpoint, it's not the most high level style, which actually walking through San Juan is, everything's amazing. We were talking about how we just stop and take pictures of every building, but there's so many layers to buildings. It's not just the architectural style, it's the cultural significance and the heritage and, the events that happen there. Getting kids involved is also really important because they will up your enthusiasm level and they can share that amongst their friends and their parents. So that's why so many sites, of course, also have educational opportunities for kids. Work with your nonprofit partners and other agency allies. And then again, making sure your local officials and your politicians are involved. So that's kind of a framework for a preservation plan. But it's also important to, of course, have a resiliency plan. And resiliency planning also addresses the land use codes and zoning that we talked about, because you want them to be consistent again and be streamlined so that there is no conflict, that the development standards are outlined, you know what incentive programs are available to you, and make sure that all the plans that your local community has will prepare people for the likely shock and stress of, unfortunately, the uncertainty of unexpected events. So once again, talking about the terminology, so disaster preparedness and recovery planning. So again, we've got the preservation plan. We're going to focus on this resiliency disaster plan. Having the same terminology is important, so we know how we're approaching the situation, and understand where you fall within the framework of your community, the local plan, as well as the entire islands plan, and what resources, both from a funding and a technical standpoint, you have available to you. And then we're going to talk about some case studies, because again, no need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of great examples out there, and there are frameworks available for you to work with. So from a terminology standpoint, adaptation. Adaptation is important because it's not just about the natural disasters that do come to mind initially. It's also the ecological or social and economic systems that respond to the climate impacts and other damage. GIS systems, very important in the documentation component of the inventory initially, and also can really aid in your response afterwards. Hazard mitigation plans kind of outline the action plan of what you're going to do. Again, there's the risk to life. Life is first and foremost, people first. And then, of course, property. Risk assessment is, again, what you do kind of ahead of time, of measuring the potential of, unfortunately, loss of life, personal injury, economic injury, because again, that component is so critical. Again, the buildings and the situation needs to be contained so it's economically feasible for a recovery. And then planning for post-disaster construction. We're going to focus a lot on that tomorrow too, from a preservation standpoint. What can you do to the buildings physically ahead of time? And how do you quickly recover after a post-disaster in terms of rehab, making sure materials get salvaged, things get dried out, and having that plan in place. So those are definitely important components. So again, and making sure that everybody understands the importance of why a disaster plan is important. So we have both the individuals and the communities prepared. Private and nonprofits sectors are important. And don't overlook the faith-based organizations. They are so very mission driven. They have some very important historical resources. I've been to some of your churches here today. They're just stunning and obviously significant, not just for Puerto Rico, but the entire world. And so to make sure you're including faith-based organizations in this planning for preservation as well as disaster response and the different levels of government and knowing how they interact. So again, it's kind of a whole community aspect. And why planning is important is it goes back to kind of what you learned earlier today is the funding resources, because if you have a plan ready and you're ready to put it into action, FEMA is going to be much more likely to be able to assist you. You're kind of ready to hit the ground running, boots on the ground with a plan that's already been documented, and it may be in your local mitigation strategy. You've already outlined, here is what we need to do. Then there's when the funding is released after a disaster event, then not only can you address the immediate situation, but you can start preempting for the next disaster, because again, that's an opportunity of when the funding has been released. businesses, it's very important. Again, I keep coming back to the economic part, because without the economic success of these structures in the community, then we're not going to be able to implement the preservation of the historic resources and cultural institutions that are so important to us. So we focus a lot on the building, but again, it's also the economic piece, and the archives and the materials and the museums, and the historical societies and their collections of how do you prepare for a disaster for those, the interiors, the furniture, and again, the archival information that's so important, and how do you reduce the risk of the disaster and then minimize the losses after and be prepared to take that. So we have a kind of a poll. It'll just be a raising of hands. To the best of your knowledge, the group that's here in the audience, which of the following plans, because there's definitely different plans, which of these incorporates historic resources and cultural resources in your community currently? Do you have a local preservation plan? Raise your hand if you have a local preservation plan. How about in your comprehensive or general plan? Have you incorporated historic resources there? No. Here's one. Do you have a resiliency or adaptation plan in place? Okay. Again, that's a great opportunity to fold in historic resources, a sustainability plan. Some communities have offices of sustainability. And actually, I even see that very much in Florida, that preservation does not get incorporated as seamlessly as it should. Yet preservation is such an important part of sustainability. I mean, we always say that the greenest building is the one that's already built, because the historic resources have so much embodied energy in them. They're almost always designed with the site in mind. They figured out where the prevailing winds were. They have transom windows, they have attic fans, they have porches and arcades. And so inherently they took the climate into consideration. They were usually sited higher. After Katrina, the mapping that was done, you could see the oldest resources were the least impacted because they were sited properly, they're on higher ground, and just so inherently you've got these more resilient buildings and these more sustainable buildings. And also by not tearing down a historic resource and building a new building, then you're not putting that embodied energy into the landfill and creating more energy to bring these building materials on the site. So, again, the sustainability office and the sustainability notion is fabulous, but we do need to fold historic buildings into that much more, because again, they are really inherently that. How about a floodplain management plan or a hazard mitigation plan? Anyone have historic resources in those? Well, we got those plans, but then when I asked, are historic buildings covered, and the hands went down. So hopefully this is, some food for thought the next time you revise your plans, making sure cultural institutions, your partners are involved, and your historic resources are really addressed in these plans. So I know I started out with asking you about, or talking about a preservation plan, a standalone plan, which is important because again, it'll put the community on the same page of what your vision is. But that doesn't mean you can't incorporate historic resources into these other plans. What about your economic development plan? Again, the resources, great, and incorporating historic resources into that, because that's the reason the reason most people travel is for heritage tourism, because you're not going to go halfway across the world just to go eat at a McDonald's, because you have that at home. You're not going to go to the Walgreens or the CVS, which are all important functions of society. I'm not saying they're not, but it's not the reason you travel. So the economic development plan, the reason you have such great tourism, besides of course your beautiful weather and beaches, is your architecture and your heritage tourism. That is what makes you so unique and is an economic driver here. And so the disaster recovery plan should again incorporate historic resources. And how do you do that? We're seeing that after storm events, historic resources are easier, letting the plaster dry out and you can recover quicker. And so tomorrow we'll talk about again strategies of how to prep a building ahead of time and how do you quickly fix a building after a disaster, especially flooding events. And it will also address wind issues tomorrow. But incorporating the priorities of a historic resources in your disaster recovery plan and your capital improvement plan. Do you have maintenance plans in place to address historic resources? Like Megan was talking about earlier, yes, you may need HVAC systems in your structures, but if your roof isn't watertight and your windows aren't secure and your building envelope isn't set, then it doesn't really help you a whole lot to do the other items. So the capital improvement plan of making sure that your resources, you have them in terms of spending funds to keep them maintained, adding the roofs, and again, where your expenditures going. So including historic resources in that, because again, it all ties back into the heritage tourism. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of where you can plug historic resources in, even if you're not doing a standalone preservation plan. So again, you've got this kind of framework. I don't know if I'm in the way here or not. So putting the different parts of preservation into these different priorities, understanding the risk, strengthening the way to manage the risk, investing in the prevention of it, but then afterwards building back better and being able to do that and putting a focus on historic resources for that. So there's a lot of ways to make sure intangible heritage and your cultural heritage and your overall resilience is covered when you are building back, because again, it's so important for the people component, the social fabric, managing the diversity and fostering dialogue while you're still monitoring this cultural change post-disaster, again, involving people in your communities. Again, knowing that FEMA is available. I think we may have a FEMA rep in the audience today. I don't know if they are still here. Thank you. If you don't know who she is and you didn't do introductions earlier, do you mind just waving? Thank you so much. You play such an important role for Puerto Rico as being the FEMA representative. Thank you. And without FEMA's framework, there's so many wonderful documents that FEMA has put out of, again, not reinventing the wheel and putting this plan in action. And so that FEMA is responsible for the united response post disaster. And so they also have, again, an emergency assistance fund. And if you're ready to go and you already know what your priorities are, it's a lot easier to get funding. But that doesn't mean that we all need, as wonderful as FEMA can be, we also need to be locally prepared. And so that's very important, and learning from other disasters that have occurred. So we're going to kind of look at some case studies, this is the National Park Service. I'll put this Katrina recovery document together. And how do you protect natural and cultural resources by having, again, actions to preserve, conserve, rehabilitate. There's that word again, because again, that is one of the 4 treatment options, and really kind of the more common approach than a true preservation approach. And again, long-term recovery of resources, because we know materials can be scarce after an event. And how do you strategize? How do you bring these structures back? How do you keep them watertight? How do you keep them secure until you're able to get the materials in place to restore them properly? And the technical assistance is also available through the National Park Service. Again, other great guides available out there through FEMA in terms of how you do a pre-disaster recovery planning guide, post-disaster, and who are the responsible entities with these different plans, because it's also, not only is it important to have the action plan and available, but knowing who's going to execute that. And as Megan was saying, people change. So don't just have one person listed. Make sure you have kind of those resources and a role identified more than an individual. And again, we do come back to making sure that you have the individuals covered. So that's both, each family should have their own plan. There's great resources for property owners. So again, we've kind of gone from the big FEMA framework to kind of more local, and then an individual role. And what do they play in having that family plan available ahead of a storm event? And I understand that after Maria, there's a lot more generators on the island, and you've taken really great steps to kind of every individually in communities be prepared for kind of a next event, but making sure that everybody has these places. And this is also where your faith-based organizations can come into play, encouraging their constituents to have that. And as employers, making sure that even your employees on an individual level understand how to prepare their homes or their properties so that they can then assist others. Again, different planning guides that are out there, they're available as resources. And I so love that people are taking pictures of the slides, but I think we're also available to share this, Maureen. For anyone who signed in, there's a sign-in sheet. We can email this presentation to you, so you'll have all these resources. And I apologize, I should have said that up front. And for anyone who is an architect or a planner, AICP, tomorrow, our session will also be available for continuing education credits. So just want to encourage you to stay for that. Again, some examples that we're going to go through. Many states have developed their own assessment and resiliency plan. Here you're looking at North Carolina and Texas, and we're going to get more into local communities. So you've kind of got the bigger level plans, and then may come down to the individual communities. The disaster recovery, debris management plan, that's so important. Recently, we had Hurricane Ian make landfall on the west coast of Florida. And so have been using a lot of our parks for the debris management with trees and building debris. And unfortunately, they have covered a lot of our burrowing owls nests. And so this was already a animal that was endangered, and now we're losing the loss of life for these animals because the debris management plan wasn't thoughtful about where it was being placed. So the burrows were covered up. So having that plan in place, having the ecological component, I know obviously you've got such amazing flora and fauna here on the island, between your birds and the frogs, and it's great, but being mindful again of your debris management plan, having a place and making sure there's no other adverse impacts of where you're storing these materials post disaster. Again, planning ahead and being prepared for after. State of North Carolina, here's a Florida one. We have our blue tarps. I know flying in, I definitely saw you all still certainly have some. In one of my neighborhoods, someone just put a metal roof on, and they put a blue metal roof on. And I always look and I think, why, after we've lived with tarps for years, why would you purposely choose that same blue and metal to put on your roof? But, again, seen it, been there with the tarps on my personal roof. I live in a historic home as well. And so, rely on other communities that have similar climates to yours to take a look at how do you do the post-disaster development plan? How do you move forward? Certainly building codes have evolved. I know they've evolved here, certainly in Florida. And that's where I think tomorrow, when we talk about the adaptation, I think it's so important to take the climate into consideration, because I am a huge fan of historic wood windows, and we should certainly preserve them if we can. There's some great products, like Armor Screen is my favorite product. I'm not sure if any of you have used it. It meets Miami-Dade County hurricane requirements. It is a lightweight fabric. It's similar to what police officers wear in their vests, and it just screws into the sides of buildings. And you do need a little bit of a deflection point, but that's a great mitigation resource for historic windows. And again, that would be ideal to protect a historic window and have it restored. But sometimes that's not possible, whether it's because you don't have the manpower, and making sure that then an impact window architecturally matches the building that you're putting it into. So again, being mindful of the climate you have and what you're facing with, and then the limits both before and after a storm event. So again, the development before and after for these storms. So here's a document for Fernandina Beach, Florida. It is a barrier island in Northeast Florida. And so a lot of the mapping has come in really handy. So if you have a strong GIS department or someone you can partner with, or at the university that you can partner with as a project. This is really helpful to identify your historic resources, where they are. You can obviously look at the FEMA maps of the flooding and what the projections are, but this really helps visually, especially to some elected officials who may not understand where your concentrations of historic resources are and the vulnerability of them, to visually show that to them. So Nassau County, which is where Fernandina Beach is housed in, has adopted as part of their comprehensive plan addressing these significant sites and historic resources. So again, different plans that you can incorporate. These are, again, we've gotten kind of from FEMA to the state, and now we're going to more local plans. So how do you, again, have your local community address? You can even get as small as neighborhood plans and incorporate resiliency planning and pre and post disaster planning. And so we've, again, kind of got that hierarchy. And we just don't want to forget the individual in this planning and the role they take, because they're going to be kind of, in essence, the first responders for their tangible property. Here's another great example. This is actually the only FEMA approved cultural resource hazard mitigation plan. It's in Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland, and they have a historic seaport, and there is not just disaster planning, but there's nuisance flooding. It could be a sunny day and the streets will flood. And so they've really had to adapt. They've almost kind of done the Venice approach, where they have floodgates at their stores and barriers, and they've just learned to live with it. So again, there is a way to adapt because it's so important for them. Also, from a heritage tourism standpoint, people come to downtown Annapolis for the historic architecture, to make sure that they're able to stay economically viable. New Bern, North Carolina, they also have a resilience plan. That's a great one to look at. These resources are all online. The entire documents are online. And so they talk about how do we improve the zoning and development codes, whether it's through their comprehensive plan amendment or their zoning and land development regulations, addressing these concerns and providing incentives to have better plans and policies in place for what's going to happen for, again, hurricanes or even just nuisance day flooding. So the major components of New Bern, North Carolina's plan are that they had a long drawn out planning process. They identified the community profile and what was important to them. What were they able to do? Their capability assessments, what is important to them from their cultural heritage, architecture, as well as other cultural aspects. How vulnerable are they? They are on the coast. And how are they going to strategically address resiliency? And then how are they going to implement that? And so those are kind of the stages of how, from development to implementation after an event. And they did take underserved and socially vulnerable populations in mind, because again, the economic piece, not everybody can run out to a big box store and buy tarps and buy plywood, and it is an expensive undertaking. Besides just physically getting there to purchase these materials to protect your property, the recovery afterwards, or standing in line for hours to get gas. So taking all aspects of your population into consideration. Again, the people component, historic properties, cultural resources, making sure the main street is going to be reactivated very quickly and back in business. That is going to help the employees and the community at large. And they have kind of stepped away from the FEMA reliance, and again, more local reliance, and doing that so by improving land use policies. City of Austin, Texas, also has a preservation plan. They have a very impressive historic preservation office. They have great videos online. They are very much about sustainability, deconstruction of buildings, and reusing materials. So they've got this very overarching approach to Austin's heritage, but also they have a hazard mitigation plan and they update it because things change. And so that's also important. Once you've identified a plan, is to make sure you're updating it. We're heading back to Florida again at the local level. The city of St. Augustine is a Spanish colonial, heavy Spanish colonial influenced city, of course, and taking all this into consideration there. They have done a lot of elevating of their buildings along the waterfront. They've rebuilt their seawall. They kept their historic seawall in place, and then they built a new one that's a little higher so that they were able to balance the historic seawall with a new one that's higher, and they're elevating structures. And tomorrow we'll go over some design review of how to successfully elevate buildings and how do you address the porches and the foundation work and the stairs so that the streetscape still maintains its continuity. Landscaping is a great way to do it, terracing, because you don't want, the streetscape to suddenly have someone jutting out like a sore thumb. And the different architectural aspects, there's a lot of tabby construction in St. Augustine with the shells in the mortar. We've got a lot of wood roofs, cedar shake roofs. And so these are old buildings that are gorgeous and they're unique. And again, it's not a material you're going to easily be able to buy off the shelf. So being prepared for the materials before and after and preserving them, and how to document them ahead of time so that if there is damage, whether we're doing a full reconstruction or just a rehabilitation, that we have that base documentation available. So they have a really great historic resource inventory, and they've certainly weathered many storms. They also have been the host of a conference called Keeping History Above Water that goes around just addressing sea level rise and resiliency issues. So again, another great local plan to look at if you want something more community oriented. St. Augustine also utilizing their GIS system and mapping to really document what are the most vulnerable sites, and how to incorporate flood and storm mitigation alternatives to address the most vulnerable sites. And one of the things that I think is very important is having kind of this emergency approval process. So they have a broader use of staff approval after a hazardous event, because you don't want to get caught up in the red tape and the bureaucracy. You've done all this planning, you've prepped your buildings, you've in post recovery, and for a building just to sit there waiting on, city approvals, town approvals, federal approvals, you don't want to get hung up there. So having an expedited review process for permitting, as well as architectural review, and giving staff more latitude in that after, is also important to build into your plan. So I would highly encourage you to have a matrix developed and available for what staff authority can happen after an event to, again, help expedite. Other places that have, again, updated their comprehensive plan, their zoning code, and their building codes to include creative ways of addressing resiliency. So whether it's an overlay or building codes to, enhance the resiliency of new development, whether there's financial incentives to do so, or a TDR program. So a TDR program is where a transfer of development rights, where you have a property you want to preserve, and it's actually very successful in West Palm Beach as well, and it can help fund mitigation measures for resiliency, is where a site, and this again, where maybe sometimes the zoning isn't consistent. You have a beautiful historic church and it's only 2 stories in height, but really the surrounding area would allow for a 10-story building. They can sell the remaining air rights or development capacity of those 8 stories somewhere else, and it's a private market transaction. And you can even earmark that money and require, if they're selling those development rights to another receiving site, that some of those funds be used for resiliency measures or preservation measures. So that's another way to enhance, and from an economic incentive way, to get buildings to be prepared ahead of time. Other tools, in some places we just have to admit this site will never work. We need to have a buyout program, and we need to let it be. We need to let nature take its course, and we will never rebuild in a certain area. And that is a hard decision to make. And documentation is very important of these buildings before you admit this is it. We're not going to rebuild in that location. So again, if there's a buyout program for coastal flood management, it's considered a managed retreat. Sometimes you see that in cities that have economically collapsed. Detroit is very famous for having done that. They've shrunk the city. As long as you're mindful of what the structures are, where and why this is happening, and so that at the end it's not a haphazard approach, then that can be a mindful solution to some situations. So again, cultural institutions, making sure your museums are incorporated into this entire planning process as well. And they have lectures. This is a great opportunity for your cultural institutions to have an evening to talk about resiliency planning, share with their community what their plans are for their archives and their documentation and their building. Because even though people may not be members of that institution, just the shared community heritage of having that in your neighborhood. You know, someone may not be a member, but they may walk by it every day and that building has significance to them. So making sure these community spaces and these cultural spaces are, preserved and prepared for resiliency. So how do you initiate a plan, right? We've talked about the different plans, the different levels. Definitely having a team of different stakeholders is really important because you want everyone's buy-in. And what we, at least in preservation, I feel we tend to do is we tend to talk to each other, and we all kind of know and we all agree, and we're like, of course this building has to be saved. But if all we do is keep talking to each other, then the other people who may appreciate the building don't understand. They don't understand the terminology or the funding behind it or the importance. So getting a broad stakeholder group is really important. And again, identifying risks, conducting a survey and a vulnerability study, writing the plan where you have clear goals, determining your alternatives. Again, as we just talked about, worst case scenario could be a buyout plan, could be a mindful retreat of a certain area, and then implementing the plan. Monitoring the plan, updating it, reevaluating it, because it's certainly, things change and you learn from past events and how you could respond better to it. So again, get the public involved, lots of great visuals, making sure you have charrettes and visual preference surveys and what's important to the community. Engage, educate, and empower the decision makers. And again, we're kind of wrapping up in terms of takeaways. No need to reinvent the wheel. Great plans out there. This is Portsmouth, New Hampshire, also a coastal community with a rich seafaring history dating back quite a ways. And so easy to search online where the historic resources are. They have very specific vulnerability assessments and actions to take. St. Augustine, again, just sunny day flooding all the time, and how to address that. And getting your preservation priorities incorporated, the community values that we talked about before, getting the buy-in and other agency partners, the pre-disaster and the economic impact, educating your elected officials on why this is so important, the value of history, because these are the costs. There are a lot of hard costs, never mind the intangible costs. $12 million to respond to the flooding, $2 million in repairs, and $1.75 million for 4 buildings. I mean, the numbers are staggering. I think we all know that in Maryland. And these are 2016 numbers. And then it's not just the actual physical loss of the physical economic impact. It's the one that you have lost by not earning money because the buildings are closed down or the businesses aren't open. 42.4 million reduced economic activity. I know those are the ones that's the same thing as the sustainability aspect of not only is it the historic building, but it's what would be encumbered if you had to bring a new building in new construction. Lost jobs. And I mean, I know the island lost many people after the storm, and they went abroad or to other states. And that is the reality of what happens if you don't plan and you're not able to recover quickly. So again, engage the public, included in all the different facets of the plans. And, figure out a way to move forward, how to recover. This would be thoughts on if any of this would work in your community. Sponsoring a lecture, like I said, at a community event. Anyone has or willing to host a resiliency lecture at your cultural institution? Other takeaways, perhaps are you going to review your hazard mitigation plan and speak to your building official after this? Hopefully you'll have an opportunity to review the flood maps in your community if you haven't already. There was this, CAMP, which is the training program the National Alliance of Preservation Commission puts together, stands for Commission Assistance Mentoring Program. And we used to send ourselves postcards at the beginning to remind ourselves, or we would write a postcard at the beginning of these sessions, and we'd mail it. And then you would get them 2 weeks later, and there were all the things you planned on doing, because you sit in these lectures and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But then 2 weeks go by and your day is busy and you're trying to do your everyday job. And then you get this reminder of, yeah, I need to follow up on that. So really hoping that there's some takeaways that you can incorporate. Technical tools are out there. Again, great sites, great documentation. The National Center for Preservation Technology and Training has great hurricane preparedness for cultural institution documents available. Great resources, of course, the Park Service that was here earlier, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, NAPC, lots of great resources are available. Main Street for the economic component, and knowing where your federal funding tools are as well. And obviously now that you all know how to write a plan, write a grant application, excuse me, you're ready for your NPS disaster recovery grants. Pensacola, they also, another coastal community. And the other thing that they do that is fun is they have an awards program, because we do all this work and we talk about the disaster, but we need to also celebrate. We need to honor the projects that have done well. So the State of Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, there is a sustainability award, and it includes if you have adapted your building for resiliency. So if you have an awards program with your cultural institution or in your community, I would highly encourage you to see if you can get one that is for a very positive, either recovery after a disaster or a preparedness, one that's very resilient, a building that's been adapted to deal with resiliency, because that really raises awareness, because you want to also celebrate the people that are doing the great jobs. And we've talked a lot about the coast, but there's also, the mountainous region of Puerto Rico and the importance of the indigenous groups, and how do you keep that, how do you educate and plan for the resilience? On their vulnerable African-American neighborhoods. There's specific grants for African-American communities. And so if that's the focus on addressing the resiliency there, that's available. Tybee Island, sea level rise adaptation plan. Again, lots of strategies that are available. And then this commission, the role of commission and staff, because everybody has to come together, again, at the different levels, but it's important for staff to help initiate a disaster resiliency planning process. They'll know where to find the funding for that. Research those funding opportunities, bring it to your commission, your local historic preservation commission, or your local city council. Again, engage in that vulnerability assessment, communicate your strategy to the public so they're aware, developing goals and objectives for the hazard mitigation planning. And then the staff will review the plans before and after for adaptability. Or if it's a big project and it requires going to the commission, then you'll have that. So that's where it's important that it's not just the head of agencies, but that your staff person and your commission knows their role. But again, identifying landmarks, reviewing the COA, certificate of appropriateness projects, whether that's again in front of a full board or just an expedited review process, and the recommending bodies that they are. So kind of just reiterating the planning and assessment ahead of time, and these are kind of takeaways. If we had to kind of condense it down, is make sure you plan ahead of time with heritage in mind, cultural resources before the disaster, communicate your plan, educate the public, use your plan, and again, collaborate. You've got all these great resources here. And that includes the streets department. Again, be creative of who you're partnering with, right? This was just couple weeks ago, California's intense storms and major highways closed down. So it's not just, it's your Department of Transportation and your street and maintenance department that also needs to be involved in that. Again, other examples, this is great. This is Curacao, not too far away. Challenges, they have similar challenges to what you're facing. Another document and the initiatives that they're taking, because they're again realizing kind of the global position they're in terms of their heritage properties. So also, they're doing the same thing. We've just been talking about identifying, assessing, monitoring disaster risks at World Heritage sites, and how do you strengthen disaster preparedness. They've got an entire document, was just published a couple years ago. And really, again, a great resource out there for you. And I think that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions, or if you have questions for each other, we can cover that. And again, I also highly encourage you to join us tomorrow for kind of a more in-depth look at how do you prepare for disasters, case studies of evaluating structures. And that, again, we do have the AIA and AICP continuing education credits tomorrow. Does anyone have any questions or comments or dialogue? No? Okay. Well, thank you then. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at 9:30, right? Tomorrow starts at 9:30? Okay.